Hi, my name is Natasha Tracy, and I'll be your host today. Thank you for joining the Healthy Place Facebook Live. We're also simulcasting on the Healthy Place YouTube channel. The topic of today's live show is life with a sexual addiction. Now, before we start, I do want to let you know that we are looking for your questions and comments. So type those into the chat box and we will get to those as soon as we can. Also, if you're looking for detailed information on sexual addiction, you can find that at healthyplace.com. Today's guest is Michelle. Now, Michelle has been dealing with sexual addiction for more than a decade. In addition to compulsive sex, Michelle was also addicted to alcohol. We appreciate you coming to share your story, Michelle. I know that, hi, there you go, hi.
Hi.
There are so many people who don't believe in sexual addiction and even make it a joke, but I know it wasn't a joke to you.
No.
So how old were you when this first started? And was there something that triggered your addiction to sex?
Well, I'll say that my sex life has always been unhealthy. In the beginning, when I first started, I felt obligated. I very quickly fell into, I owe this person. I can't say no right now. And I didn't really have a good sense of boundaries. So all of that plus the alcohol made me very vulnerable to this addiction. And then, it manifested, I'd say, in my 20s when I went completely wild, drinking, blacked out. It was awful. Um, and it took a lot of years of recovery to kind of get to a place where I could say, I have a problem, because I knew I was acting out, but I was sort of glamorizing what I was doing. I was saying, I'm partying, I'm having fun. You're just jealous. I made a complete mess of my life. I was miserable and depressed, but I wouldn't let myself see that. And being around so many enablers, around party people, I was bartending constantly. I never got that input that, hey, this isn't normal. This shouldn't be your life. So it did take a while, and it took an overhaul of my entire life.
So when you were addicted to sex, what was it like for you? What was going through your mind?
It's hard to say because it wasn't like a thought process. It wasn't like thinking. It was something like a switch that went off in my head. And it was very quick, it was very clear, and it was very single focus. I want this, get this. I want this, I get this. And the more that was part of my life, it took over. I don't want to say possessed, but it really felt like that would switch and then I would disappear. This person was gone and I was off, and I wouldn't know what this body would do. I didn't know where I would wake up. I didn't know who did what to me or what I did. It was constant. And when I was dealing with the shame of that, it fed the cycle. Shame, drink, do it again. Shame, drink, do it again. And I was acting out, and it was just a very hopeless and desperate situation.
Thank you. If you are just joining us, folks, welcome to the Healthy Place Facebook Live. We are talking to Michelle about her decade-long struggle with sexual addiction and how that affected her life. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box and we will get to it shortly. And we're also looking for your comments. If you are addicted to sex, how has that affected you? Let us know in the comments as we go along. So, Michelle, one of the reasons that people have sex, of course, is because it's pleasurable. But it sounds like it wasn't pleasurable for you. What was having sex actually like for you?
It's a really good question. And that's a big reason why people think sex addiction doesn't exist. It's an excuse because you're having so much fun and you're enjoying it. It is not. It was the most powerless and degrading experience of my life for many years. And in a way, that feeling, that shame and that disgust that I would feel was part of my addiction. That was part of what I craved. And it's like any other addiction where you need that to feel normal. I didn't feel normal if I didn't feel that sort of self-loathing, and I only got that through sex. It was sort of acting this out. Honestly, I can say this now after years of therapy, sex had very little to do with what I was doing. I was really just acting out this sort of deep emptiness inside of me. you know. But yeah, there wasn't pleasure. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, please. I'm the one who's not to be interrupting you. Um, I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned that sex addiction was a way for your need to act out a need for approval and to deal with this sense of self-loathing, right?
Yes.
That's what you were talking about.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that it's difficult for someone to sort of put themselves in the mind of someone who actually needs self-loathing. Like, can you talk a bit about that?
It's great. And I love hearing that because it's difficult for me not to be in that mindset. It's hard for me to remember that people actually just enjoy sex. It's like, hey, this is fun. It's really hard for me. Because even in movies, when things interact, I say, hey, that's could be abusive. That could be wrong. But I forget people actually like it. um, it is hard to explain because what I'm saying is that our mindset, our association is very different from it. For me, it just was what made me feel normal. It was the only thing that made sense. There's so many different elements to it. Like I didn't know how to exist in this world without being this kind of object. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know my worth. Everything was tied into this. So it was almost survival. It was like without this, I don't know who I am. I have no reason to be here. And it was feeding all of this. But yeah, it is hard to explain unless you've had that sort of feeling. If you've ever identified with something so much, this is who you are. This is your worth. You are nothing more than this. And then the rest just sort of plays itself out.
So, as you said, you got into this cycle of drinking, sex, shame, more drinking, and then the cycle continued. People who get involved in that type of cycle often end up in dangerous situations. Was this something that happened for you?
It happened to me, and it happens. I want to be clear. If you are a sex addict, if this is part of it's a matter of time. It's really a matter of time because again, pointing back to addiction, the sort of behavior sort of loses its potency. You start needing more. You start wanting to go out more, and you put yourself out there and you put yourself at risk. You become more vulnerable. And there are people who will gladly take advantage of that. And that's not just women, that's men too, who are in this situation. Yeah, it was a part of my life. And it was so much so that I even normalized it. The fact that I woke up and didn't know what was done to me was just part of my life. That is just the reality of being in this world. That happens. I had no way of knowing how to stop it. So in a sense, I accepted it. This is it. It's awful, but this is it. And I drank. And then it just kept continuing. So yeah.
I think that sense that you can't stop is such a sign of addiction.
Yeah.
You are sober now and getting professional treatment, which is amazing.
Lots
So,
of professionals. I can't tell you how much I've tried everything. Just putting it out.
okay. So, what brought you to the point of deciding that you needed to get help?
It was it was hard, and it gets more complicated because what I'm dealing with now is called sexual anorexia. And it's almost as if I was 100% like 100 miles an hour one direction, slam on the brakes other direction.
Mhm.
And I lost any ability to tolerate touch and intimacy and anything. And I can't even say intimacy. It was not intimate, but any sort of anything sexual, even on TV, it just sort of shut off. So I stopped the sexual acting out a long time ago, about 11 years ago. It wasn't until I started getting into a relationship that I realized I can't do this. And then I started getting help. Then I realized there's a lot more to this. So,
So, Jane actually has a question for you, and Jane asks, "What kinds of dangerous things actually happened? Can you give us some examples?"
a lot of things because you're drunk, you're putting yourself out in bars and stuff. I blacked out so many times. I was drugged. I was kidnapped. I woke up in a car somewhere with two men I never seen before. This was normal in my mind. This was just, hey, take me back. You're rude. Not these men
Mm.
were just about to rape me. What is happening here? I didn't see it that way. It was constant, that dangerous situation. And then I was traveling with a man, and we were both doing these sort of reckless things, and he was sexually assaulted too. And this is what happens when you're out there.
So maybe you could share one or two things that you've discovered about yourself now that you are in therapy and you're working so hard.
Well, the first thing I would say is boundaries. Boundaries would have uh, prevented a lot of this. There were so many times when this is happening, during or pursuing or whatever it is, where I wanted to stop and I didn't feel I had the right to say, I'm going to stop this. You know, this guy bought me a drink. I can't stop this. This guy did this. I can't stop this. I might as well. It became so little. It's like, just do it. Just get it over with. Just, if I had a better sense of being able to say, you know what, I just don't want to with you. I don't have to. I don't owe you anything. If that was sort of cemented in my mind, I don't think I would have gone as far as I did. I probably would have gone a little crazy, but it wouldn't have gotten this far.
So Karen asks, did your friends reach out to you during this time with any concerns that they may have had?
It's a good question, because what happened was, my friends, my real friends, the people who cared and loved me, became really boring. I'm like, why are you ruining my party? I'm having fun. And when it was starting, it was just sort of this party, you're just whatever. And I dismissed them. I dismissed their concerns. What happened was I eventually removed myself from them, and they removed themselves from me too. I just became very toxic and reckless and so on. My friends were replaced with just other bartenders, other party people, other alcoholics and addicts. And we were all enabling each other. You know, this happened to that person. I'm there to cheer them up. Don't worry about this, all of this. So no, I didn't really get that outside look for sorry, very often. And when I did, I didn't respond to it very well because I thought there was something wrong with them.
So just to wrap up, if there's anyone out there right now who's struggling with sexual addiction, what's your advice for them?
There's a lot of advice, and it's a little tricky. I mean, I would say the first thing is, if you're in a relationship, is to be honest with your partner. I think you owe that to your partner. The first thing is to just lay it all out on the table. This is what I'm dealing with, and these are realities, because you're not thinking rationally when that thing is happening. You could bring back a disease. You could come back pregnant. These are things that could be introduced in your relationship. So the first thing is to be honest with the people or with that person around you. Getting help was what helped me the most, was getting specifically trauma therapy. I've worked with a hypnotist. I did EMDR. Those were two things that were very, very effective at helping me see the trauma that was fueling this sort of cycle. But yeah, I can't say, just stop doing it. Just stop, because I know, that's not really realistic for a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for coming on today, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've been through a lot, and I hope things continue to improve along your journey of recovery. Our next guest is Dr. Heidi Green. Dr. Green specializes in trauma therapy and is a blogger for HealthyPlace. I appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Green.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you heard Michelle's experience with compulsive sex, alcoholism, and the traumatic consequences that resulted from that, including being kidnapped and drugged and raped on multiple occasions. Yet even with all of that horror in her life, she couldn't break the cycle. Can you provide some insight as to why that would be? What exactly keeps one engaging in behaviors that are so destructive? And what does it take to actually get out of that cycle?
Okay, so these are great questions, and I'm gonna back up a little bit, because I think with people struggling with any kind of addiction, whether it be sex or alcoholism, gambling, shopping, whatever it is, addiction at its root is compulsive comfort seeking, and individuals who feel the need to compulsively comfort and self-soothe are people who are dealing with chronic distress. And so we have to look at, where does that chronic distress come from? Why are you feeling so chronically in pain that you need to self-soothe in such a chronic way? And so usually the trauma begins before the addiction. And so there will be some sort of toxic stress, dysfunctional family relationships, or some other kind of trauma that happens in a person's life that creates the chronic distress that leads to the addictive behavior. And oftentimes the addictive behavior has some sort of correlation to what the trauma is. So if, for example, here's a common kind of start to sex addiction. A child maybe lives in a home that is pretty chronically, chaotic, stressful. There may not be a lot of emotional support in the home. The child may really lack coping skills for how to care for themselves, but learns at a pretty young age that masturbation feels good. It gives them some relief, this temporary relief from the emotional pain they experience, and they learn that sexual acting out can be a respite for their pain, and then that carries on into adulthood. And it can be the same with anything. If the child learns to soothe with food, then an eating disorder may be in their future. But with sex addiction, often what we see is a person who either learned how to self-soothe with sexual acting out when they were pretty young, or maybe learned at a young age, that connecting with another person sexually brought them some emotional relief. And then it just snowballs as the person continues to grow into adulthood and doesn't learn healthier skills for self-soothing. And so what happens is this cycle develops in the course of an addiction, where the person feels distress, they choose to act out in whatever way brings them some temporary relief. Then they feel usually an enormous amount of shame for whatever happened during the addictive part of the cycle. And they sit with that shame until it's intolerable again. And that intolerability leads up to seeking what they know will work, what will give them a little bit of respite for a short period of time. And then the cycle just goes and goes round and round.
So that sounds really tough to be in, and sounds really tough to get out of. So what does it take to get out of that destructive cycle?
I love that Michelle said that trauma work was the most important piece for her, because I really do think that is the most important piece, that we can't really stop behavior unless we deal with whatever is the underlying cause of behavior. And so obviously as a trauma therapist, my bias would be that we need to go and pull that root, right? Like this behavior comes from a source, and unless we deal with the source, you might be able to stop the behavior, but then you're just white knuckling it. You're still struggling because the issue didn't get resolved. So for me, I think one of the most important pieces is being able to do the self-reflection, the self-awareness work that helps you identify, where did this come from? Where is my source of chronic internal distress coming from? And then deciding, with hopefully the help of a skilled either trauma therapist or addiction therapist, or somebody who does a little bit of both, can help you come up with a path forward, whether it be EMDR, whether it be narrative therapy and kind of working through your story and rewriting your story, whether it be somatic experiencing, which really helps people release trauma that gets held in their body. There's lots of different types of therapy, and while some are more popular than others, not everything works for everybody. And so it's really important to have a therapist who is able to really know you and the way that your brain works and the way that you think and respond to things, that can be flexible and adaptive with you and help you find the modality that's going to help you heal best.
So I'm sure we have people watching right now who are addicted to sex, but haven't necessarily been impacted in the way that Michelle has. I'd like you to address, please, as a psychologist, whether you think that sexual addiction is real, whether it's a serious mental health issue, and some of the other consequences of being a sex addict.
Okay, great. Good questions. So and tough questions. So let me think about how I want to answer this. I do think sex addiction is real, but I also believe that people can become addicted to anything. So if you look at our, our DSM, the diagnostic manual that we use as mental health professionals to give people diagnoses, sex addiction isn't in there. And the reason that it isn't in there is because there hasn't been enough of a robust body of research as a foundation for making it a diagnosis. So there is actually, there's a large group of people in the professional field doing that research now so that they can make a case to add it to the DSM so that will be an official diagnosis. So while it's not now clearly, it's real because sexual acting out can destroy a person's life. It can destroy a person's relationships. It can end a person's life. I mean, it can be that dangerous. And so when we're looking at what is addiction, well, addiction is behavior that continues despite terrible consequences, and that inability to stop even when it's really harming you and harming the people around you. That in and of itself can be considered enough to say, I'm addicted to this. And so absolutely, I've seen time and time again, people whose sexual acting out behaviors is literally destroying their lives. And they do feel that compulsion, like they can't stop. So yes, I think it's real. Tell me what your second question was again.
So whether it's a serious mental health issue, which I think you've addressed quite nicely, and then some of the other consequences of being a sex addict, which I think you've also addressed quite nicely. So I do actually just want to end the segment with two things. And the first thing I'd like you to talk about is what is actually the treatment for sexual addiction and how effective is it for people? I know you've mentioned a few things, but maybe you could say what the most common type is.
Okay, so there are. Well, I'll tell you that what's very common is that people will seek out a person who has a certification in sex addiction. So there is a program that therapists can go through. I've actually been through the training to become a certified sex addiction therapist, or a CSAT. So CSATs will learn how to treat the trauma that underlies the addiction, and will also help people to reframe their sexual templates. Because the other thing that can happen in sex addiction is that people become sexually interested in things that maybe aren't aligned with their values. So we see a lot of times, people are acting out in sexual ways that might not be they might not be legal, or they might be in a relationship with somebody and they're cheating on their spouse or their partner, and so they're doing things that don't align with who they are. And so part of the work is to help people kind of rewire how they're able to get excited sexually, how they're able to connect with other people in not just a sexual way, but an emotionally intimate way in their sexual behavior, and just kind of get their sexual template healthy again. And then the other piece that's really important is a sobriety plan. And so oftentimes people will participate in 12 steps. Sex Addiction Anonymous is very popular. Also, so there's Sexaholics Anonymous and then Sex Addicts Anonymous. They're two different programs, but they're both 12-step programs. And they can be very helpful for people so that they have a community of people who understand, who don't stigmatize their behavior. Stigma really comes out a lot with sex addiction because people have preconceived notions about it, that sex addicts are sex offenders. That is not the case. That sex addicts are just, they'll use terrible words like, oh, they're just perverts or whatever. That's not the case. I mean, these are people who are hurting and who are trying to soothe their pain. And so to be part of a community that understands that and is gracious and accepting and loving and non-judgmental is also a really critical part of healing.
So I've got one question here from George as well, and that's, why do people who have a trauma of rape sometimes end up as a sex addict or being promiscuous?
Such a great question. Okay, so this is what we refer to as trauma reenactment, where a person who feels stuck in this trauma, this unresolved trauma that has happened in their life, they replay it in a way that is slightly different, where they can have control. So if I'm sexually promiscuous, I'm controlling that. If I'm being sexually harmful to another person, I'm controlling that. If I'm being sexually harmful to myself, I'm in control. And the person kind of falsely believes that by having control of the trauma or the traumatic behavior, that is somehow relieving the trauma that they experienced initially. Trauma reenactment is really common, but it is a false sense of power and control, and really people need to do the healing work to resolve the trauma so that they no longer feel that compulsion to reenact it.
I think you explained that so well. Thank you. I do want to end today and say that Dr. Heidi Green, her book is coming out very soon. It is called The Path to Self-Love and World Domination, which sounds great.
Yeah.
It's available on Amazon now for pre-order, but will be released and available everywhere on September 22nd. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Pleasure talking to you.
So that concludes our Facebook Live for today. Thank you to all of our Facebook and YouTube viewers. We are so glad you joined us. For trusted, detailed information on all aspects of mental health, including symptoms, treatment, self-help tools, relationships, and more, I do hope you'll visit healthyplace.com. We will be back in 2 weeks with